Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Michele Lancione. With AbdouMaliq Simone, I co-direct the Beyond Inhabitation Lab. And today we have the great pleasure of having Ida Danewid with us. Today's seminar, which is part of our Spring 2026 seminar series, is going to be introduced by our dear colleague at the lab, Francesca Guarino. Francesca is a postdoctoral fellow working on migration, critical approaches to solidarity and racialization in the context of Palermo. So, Francesca, please introduce Ida to us, and then we start.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, and welcome. Welcome, Ida. So, I will just give a very brief introduction. Ida Danewid is Associate Professor of Gender and Global Political Economy at the University of Sussex. She's the author of Resisting Racial Capitalism, an Antipolitical Theory of Refusal, which I would say is a beautiful, beautiful exploration of state violence and anti-political struggles across time and space. And she's also co-editor of the Black Mediterranean, Bodies, Borders, and Citizenship. Her work has appeared in Antipode, South Atlantic Quarterly, International Political Sociology, and International Studies Quarterly, among other places. And she also co-edits the journal Globalizations. Thank you, Ida, for joining us, and I'll give you the floor. Thank you.
You're right.
No, sorry. Do this.
I'm going to set everything up for you.
Perfect.
Okay. I'm going to share the screen for the people at home.
Great.
Yes, they see that, and I'm going to just to make it full screen.
Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect.
Yep.
All right.
The floor is yours.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. Both to Michele, obviously, for organizing this and for bringing me here. And also a big thank you to Francesca for the warm introduction. So I kind of want to preface what I'm about to say by just making it very clear, right, that this is something that I've only recently started working on, right? I'm quite excited about it, but by no means is it a kind of complete or, you know, a polished product, right? So I really welcome like all forms of feedback, any suggestions that you might have. I hope that this can be a space where we kind of think together around some of these issues. So let me start here, right? Almost immediately after firing the shots that killed Brian Thompson, right? He was the CEO of private healthcare provider United Healthcare. Luigi Mangione was celebrated as a messiah-like figure across much of social media. In a time of skyrocketing medical debt, of housing precarity, of growing inequalities, and where care, as Nancy Fraser puts it, has been commodified for those who can pay for it and privatized for those who cannot, right? In many ways, these reactions are not that surprising, right? Over the last 4 decades, neoliberal policies have dismantled the welfare state, shifting resources into prisons, policing, and other carceral entities, and effectively turning basic care services and support systems, so things like health and social care, housing, schooling, and public assistance, into sites of accumulation, of extraction, and of surveillance. I think we see the results of this all around us, but let me just point you to a couple of examples, right? So I'll start with the UK, which is where I'm based, and where a recent report that came out just last week revealed that more than a fifth of all children that are born after the year 2013 have been scarred by poverty for at least half of their childhoods, which the report claimed is a direct result of the austerity measures, right, and the cuts in welfare that have been imposed by the Conservative government in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. In the UK, it's today common that patients die while waiting for long times for ambulances to show up after they've called 999. Hundreds of schools are at risk of collapse from crumbling concrete, and disability benefits have just been cut in half for new claimants, in a move which disability organizers say will push people into financial hardship and place many people at risk of eviction. Turning to the Netherlands, right, in 2021, it was revealed that for years the Dutch tax authority had wrongly accused thousands of families of fraud over childcare benefits and demanded a full repayment of benefits. Right, and sometimes this were in the ranges of tens of thousands of euros. Now, the tax authority didn't just make errors, but it also systematically singled out certain groups as being so-called high risk. And those were in particular immigrant and ethnic minority families, and especially those of Moroccan and of Turkish descent. In Denmark, meanwhile, the so-called ghetto policy that was introduced in 2018 allows the state to cut social housing, to demolish apartment blocks, and to sell off properties in areas where at least half of residents have so-called non-Western backgrounds, right? Which is here very much used as a code word for Muslim and non-white areas. And so, right, in this context, calls to fund and to defend infrastructures of care and of welfare, what Bonnie Honey calls public things that are provided by the state and secured by its sovereignty. Right? This might seem quite straightforward, right? And in fact, these proposals, right, underwrite much of the contemporary left across a range of different contexts and geographies. But understandable as such calls are, right? And I really want to emphasize that, of course, right, they are very understandable, and I'm very sympathetic to much of this. But I think, right, at the same time, sometimes here there's an assumption that is taken for granted that the welfare state itself is a benevolent institution, right, that simply needs to be better funded. I think some of these assumptions also show up in parts of the recent literature on abolition, right? Here, care is often seen as the radical opposite of carcerality, and it's a powerful frame for abolition. So take, for example, the activist slogan, "Fund care, not cops." As the Care Collective writes in the Care Manifesto, the goal is effectively to restore and to radically deepen our welfare state, both centrally and also locally. Again, what is taken for granted here, right, as well as in more conventional leftist politics that call for the nationalizing and the rebuilding of welfare institutions, is the assumption that it is the neoliberal state that is the problem, right, and not the welfare state more generally. And so in contrast to this, my project examines the development of state-sponsored care and welfare through a focus on histories of empire, racial capitalism, and dispossession. And so specifically, I'm interested in charting the role of state infrastructures of care in bordering bourgeois whiteness and those who have been situated at the racialized threshold of dirt, disease, and so-called underservingness. And I also want to look at the manifold ways in which welfare institutions themselves have operated on the basis of carceral logics by creating healthy and so-called improved productive workers, while simultaneously warehousing those who are discarded as being waste and surplus. Ultimately, I want to argue that the recent neoliberal period of austerity and of so-called punitive welfare should be regarded not simply as a dismantling, right, or as a rollback of the welfare state, but rather as a retrenchment and as an intensification of logics that have long structured state-sponsored care and welfare under racial capitalism. And so what we're seeing today is, from this perspective, right, less of a straightforward crisis of welfare and more of a reconfiguration along older, uneven, and deeply racialized lines. And so for me, right, this raises really crucial questions about what it might mean then, not just to fund the welfare state, but to actually rethink questions of care and social reproduction beyond capital and state power, right? And that's what I'm calling fugitive care. So let me say something about the conventional literature, right, around this, right, where the welfare state quite often, right, is regarded as a protective response to the disruptive effects of capitalism, right, including to poverty, unemployment, and inequality. T.H. Marshall, for example, regards the welfare state as the culmination of expanding citizenship rights. So he suggests that this is something that began in the 18th century, right, with struggles around civil and political rights. And then in the 20th century, right, it was extended to also include basic economic and social rights, such as the right to education, to healthcare, and to social security. Just as being Anderson, drawing on Karl Polanyi's notion of the counter-movement, similarly sees welfare as an institutionalized defense of society against market dislocation. And so welfare is, in his view, a reaction against the worst ills of capital, and it's a re-embedding, right, of the economy into society. More recently, Wolfgang Streeck has also built on Polanyi to argue that post-World War welfare states are part of a temporary settlement between capital and democracy, right? And it's something that's now, he suggests, unraveling under neoliberalism. In a new book, David Matthews similarly emphasizes the central role of labor movements, right, and trade unions. And so the welfare state is, according to Matthews, the product of hard-fought gains that have been achieved by labor. Now, right, many thinkers have, of course, pushed back against some of these rather celebratory accounts. And perhaps most famously, right, Michel Foucault argues that welfare institutions are central to biopolitics and to its carceral archipelago. And so modern states manage populations through health systems, through welfare policies and demographic data, and by intervening to optimize well-being and productivity of populations. And so the welfare state then, right, is, in his view, not primarily about reducing inequality, but is rather about managing, is about disciplining and producing certain kinds of subjects. Marxist scholars, right, have similarly argued that welfare is about reproducing labor power, it's about managing class conflict and supporting accumulation. And so rather than hampering the forces of capital, welfare states actually support and stabilize it. And so systems such as healthcare, education, and housing ensure that workers are healthy, right, they're skilled, and they're able to work. And they also reduce the risk, right, of unrest and potentially of revolution. Now, it seems to me, right, that while some of these approaches, of course, right, are not without their merit, right, I think they do capture some very important elements. But at the same time, they do provide an account and a way of thinking about welfare, which is completely cut off, right, from histories around colonial conquest, of land dispossession, and of racial oppression. And because of that, they also largely ignore the role of racism and of colonialism and the ways in which these things have been and also continue to operate, right, as structuring forces within welfare. There is, of course, right, a growing decolonial literature on how the building of Europe's welfare states, especially Britain, relied on colonial extraction, unequal trade, and racialized labor regimes. And here I'm in particular thinking of work by people like Utsa Patnaik and Gominda Bambra. And I'm interested in very much building on this, but by also adding to it, by exploring how state-sponsored forms of care have functioned as racialized technologies of pacification, expropriation, abandonment, and control. And so here I'm very much, right, building on work that I began to develop in my first book, Resisting Racial Capitalism, an Antipolitical Theory of Refusal. So this book theorizes the role of state power in the making of racial capitalism. And by examining the global histories and the contemporary articulations of 4 different modalities of state violence, right? So there are chapters here that look at policing, bordering, wastelanding, and reproductive control. The book effectively studies how racial capitalism emerged alongside a very particular conception of the political, centered around the anti-democratic and the hierarchical question of how to be governed. And so in contrast, right, to the fiction popularized by liberalism, namely, right, that the state is a product of individuals freely consenting to be ruled, the book shows that the state first emerged as part of a ruling class response to the revolutionary struggles that swept through Europe in the late medieval period, and that called for an end to serfdom, private property, economic exploitation, and hierarchical authority. As a counter-revolution from above, state formation then was from the very beginning a racial and a colonial project that entailed both internal centralization and domination, as well as external conquest and enslavement.
But
yes.
Can I ask you to to use, please,
Of course.
if you can.
Of course. All right. Can you hear me in the back? Yes. Okay. Awesome. And so put differently, right, the state has always been a racial state. Racism and racialization have never just been corrupted or exceptional features that were imported from the colonies or from the fringes of the far right, but rather, right, these have been central to the state form since its inception. And so in this new project, right, I'm essentially extending some of this analysis to specifically think about the racialized history of care and welfare. And to get to grips with this, I think that we have to turn to the late 19th century and the wider shift that was taking place around that time from laissez-faire to state-managed capitalism. So this was a time of heightened inter-imperial rivalry, of anti-colonial rebellions, and of anxieties about racial mixing and so-called degeneration. It was also a time of labor militancy and of growing fears among the elite that the lumpen proletariat, right, the so-called underserving poor, would throw in their lot and unite with organized labor. And so in this context, it was increasingly argued that laissez-faire capitalism was dangerous and that new state institutions had to be created that had the power to pacify, to survey, to regulate, to cleanse, and to contain. And in making these arguments, social reformers were very much drawing on eugenics and racialized ideas around hygiene, cleanliness, and degeneracy. And so I appreciate, right, that today eugenics has, of course, come to be associated with Nazi Germany, right? But eugenic science, in fact, first emerged in Britain. And so the term eugenics was coined by Francis Galton in his book, Hereditary Genius, that came out in 1869. Galton was a half-cousin of Charles Darwin, and he effectively fused Darwin's ideas about natural selection with Adolf Quetelet's statistical notion of the average man. And so he defined eugenics as the science of improving human stock through better breeding. Eugenics quickly became popular among the intellectual elite as well as social reformers. And so this was not at all, right, a fringe phenomenon, nor was it the sole prerogative of those that we today, right, would describe as having been conservative, right, with right-wing views and so on. Mary Stopes, the British birth control campaigner, was, for example, a vocal supporter of eugenics. She viewed contraception not just as a tool for women's empowerment, which is how she's often remembered and talked about today, but she also saw it as a means to improve the racial health and the happiness of the Anglo-Saxon race by preventing the reproduction of those that she described as the unfit and the inferior. To this end, she even marketed her own brand of the cervical cap, which she called the pro-race cap. And so eugenicists often likened themselves to a gardener, to someone who plants and cultivates his garden, someone who cares for those plants that are useful, and at the same time weeds out those that are not. As H.G. Wells, another eugenics supporter, puts it, he writes, "The eugenicist seeks to make a plan as one designs and lays out a garden, so that sweet and seemly things may grow, wide and beautiful vistas open, and weeds and foulness disappear. What makes the garden's graciousness and beauty possible," he continues, "is the scheme and the persistent intention, the watching and the waiting, the digging and the burning, the weeder clips and the hoe. This, Wells suggests, is the foundation of the modern utopia." And so H.G. Wells was a member of the Fabian Society, which had a major influence on the development of social democracy, trade unionism, and the creation of the welfare state in Britain. Founded in London in 1884 by Sidney and Beatrice Webb, the Fabians sought to advance social democracy through gradual reform, right, rather than through revolutionary means. To their membership, they counted prominent intellectuals like H.G. Wells, but also people like George Bernard Shaw and Bertrand Russell. The Fabians are also very well known for being the founders of the London School of Economics and Political Science. And so intellectually, right, the Webbs sought to promote the ascendance of what they called industrial democracy, which would encourage the improvement of the healthiest, the fittest, and the most productive parts of society, and the simultaneous removal and disciplining of the sick and the unproductive, what Sidney Webb in one of his articles refers to as parasites. Eugenics was, in other words, absolutely central to the social reform policies that was espoused by the Fabians. As George Bernard Shaw puts it in Man and Superman, the only fundamental and possible socialism is the socialization of the selective breeding of man. That, he continues, is the only way to avoid degeneration of type, that is, race deterioration, if not race suicide. H.G. Wells similarly argues in A Modern Utopia that an ideal social society, the state will forbid the procreation of those that are considered to be unfit. And by that, he especially means Catholics, Jews, and immigrants, who, he writes, breed freely. Other intellectuals like John Maynard Keynes and William Beveridge, two thinkers who are regarded as having been absolutely essential to the expansion of the British welfare state, both before and after the Second World War. They weren't formally members of the Fabian Society, but they very much moved in the same circles, and they worked closely with them. Keynes also acted as vice president of the Eugenics Society from 1947 to 1944. Well, Beveridge believed, and I'm quoting here, that good stock should be allowed to breed while bad stock would be ameliorated through state intervention. Most of the Fabians' interventions focused on what they referred to as the urban residuum, right, which is a category that was seen to constitute a distinct class below the respectable and the hard-working classes, and which included, and I'm quoting here from Sidney Webb, the sick and the crippled, the idiots and the lunatics, the epileptic, the blind and the deaf and the dumb, the criminals and the idle, and all who are morally deficient. According to the Webbs, there were at least 4 million members of this pauper class that were living in overcrowded British cities, where they displayed antisocial, criminal, and idle tendencies. This was worsened by the fact that this destitute underclass, which the Webbs referred to as a moral malaria, was also very prone, they argued, to reproduce themselves, and much more so than the middle classes. And so failure here to intervene eugenically, either positively, and so by encouraging the middle classes and the deserving working classes to have more children, or negatively, and so by making it more difficult for this underclass to procreate. If nothing was done, right, the result would be what the Fabians describe as race suicide. They further argued that it was the duty of the state to prevent this. And so in other words, right, an effective welfare state would need to be created, one that would ensure that the healthy, fit, and productive would prevail over the degenerate, destitute, and delinquent. As Sidney Webb puts it, maybe I don't have that quote. Anyhow, I'll read it out. The deliberate manipulation of the environment of the individual amidst the complex conditions of a modern industrial community involves collective regulation and a highly developed social machinery. No consistent eugenicist can be a laissez-faire individualist unless he throws up the game in advance. He must interfere, interfere, interfere. And so, right, one of the key drivers of this growing intellectual attack on the principles of laissez-faire was the fear of imperial decline and racial degeneration. And so a common theme in eugenics, so-called research, was to interpret human history as being the story of the rise and the fall of different races. Powerful empires, or so the argument went, would eventually grow decadent and complacent, and that would eventually lead them to being overtaken by less civilized ones. And so a crucial factor in ensuring imperial success was therefore the maintenance of a racial standard and the prevention of racial degeneration. This was especially pertinent in a time of growing anxieties of Britain's industrial supremacy and heightened inter-imperial rivalry, and where anti-colonial revolts and insurrections spread throughout the British Empire like an infection or a contagion. And so in this context, right, eugenic fears of racial degeneration, right, effectively of the colonies and the Orient coming home to haunt and to infect the heart of whiteness, right, this was very much paramount. As Robbie Shilliam has argued, discussions about the deserving and the undeserving poor, right, or between those who were seen to be hardworking and morally pure, and those who were regarded as waste, unproductive, and a burden on society, in other words, the residuum. This very much played out against the colonial backdrop. The residuum was seen not just as a distinct class, but they were frequently referred to as a race of pygmies, social savages, and white chimpanzees. The London slums that were inhabited by these undeserving poor were similarly likened to jungles and to a dark continent, right? So this is the darkest of England, as this poster by the Salvation Army puts it. Such imperial anxieties also were also fueled by racial panics over migration, right? Especially over Jewish immigrants who were coming from Eastern Europe. In 1902, the British Brothers League, which is a populist anti-immigration group, organized a 4,000-strong rally in Mile End calling for British homes for British workers. And 3 years later, in 1905, the Aliens Act was passed, which is the first immigration restriction to be implemented on the British mainland. So this fear of immigration was coupled with a similar fear of the consequences of emigration, and in particular of the departure of healthy young men who would go off to the colonies, which increased the risk of miscegenation, and it also meant that the British metropole was left with a higher proportion of the so-called defective and degenerate residuum. Add to this concerns about militant labor and working class organizing. Towards the end of the 19th century, it was widely accepted that the residuum, right, far from constituting a kind of fringe and marginal population, in fact, had become a substantial part of the working class, and that this underclass, as Gareth Statement Jones puts it, was large enough to engulf all of civilized London. So there was increasingly a worry here that the respectable working class might unite with the residuum and choose to rebel. And thus, from the 1880s and onwards, the British press was full of warnings of the necessity of immediate reform in order to ward off the impending revolutionary threat. And so in this context, right, social reformers like the Webbs argued that the policy of laissez-faire was dangerous and that it had to be replaced with a more interventionist system. The challenge was one of how to ensure that Britain was not overrun by those who would threaten the integrity of the Anglo-Saxon race, a threat that simultaneously, right, was seen to come from the inside, but also from the outside. And it was one that had to be urgently contained, quarantined, and sanitized. At the same time, it was also urgent that the respectable and the deserving working classes be allowed to participate more actively in social and public life, and to have their grievances met. And so as Statement Jones writes, throughout the 1890s, the Fabians were pretty much preaching in the wilderness. But after the failures of the Boer War in 1905, right, that really turned out to be a turning point as a moral panic about the fitness of British troops all of a sudden, right, set in and became very widespread. And with that, the Fabians' arguments about the inherent link between the health of the British Empire on the one hand and the need for social reform on the other became widely accepted. There's the quote. And so all of this really came together in the Minority Report that was published in 1909, and which was offered by Beatrice Webb as part of the Royal Commission on the Poor Laws. Today, right, this report is very much seen as a cornerstone of what was to become the British welfare state. William Beveridge contributed as a researcher to the report, and he would later comment that his own 1942 report on social insurance and allied services, which is regarded as being the inauguration, right, of the British welfare state proper. He said that this really stemmed from what all of us had imbibed from the Webbs. And so specifically, the minority report argued for the abolition of the 1834 Poor Laws and the creation of a new form of systemic welfare. It based this on the idea that this older Victorian poor relief system was too weak, right? Even though it did make a kind of distinction between those poor who were deserving and therefore could claim relief, and those who, on the other hand, were seen to be undeserving and therefore unable to access support. But crucially, the Poor Laws had no real power to detain, to control, or to intervene, and they could only specify the conditions upon which relief was effectively granted. And so this report argued that this was ineffective, right? Thus, this underclass, the residuum, found ways to sustain themselves outside of the system. And at worst, right, the Poor Laws might even encourage idleness and undeserving traits. As Sidney Webb details in an article published in the Eugenic Review titled Eugenics and the Poor Law, he writes, the existing Poor Law operates almost exclusively as an anti-eugenic influence. The Poor Law, he continues, encourages the survival of the lowest parasite. He goes on, and I'm quoting here, what we as eugenicists have got to do is to scrap the old Poor Law with its indiscriminate relief of the destitute as such, and replace it by an intelligent policy of so altering the social environment as to discourage or prevent the multiplication of those irrevocably below the national minimum of fitness, whilst at the same time increasing the opportunities of those more prudent and thrifty classes who alone are discouraged by our present system from undertaking the responsibilities of parenthood. In other words, right, what he's saying is that the Poor Laws need to be broken up and replaced with a new system of social welfare, designed to care for those who are seen to be deserving and at the same time contain, pacify, and exclude those regarded as being idle, unproductive, and a burden to society. And so in the US, eugenic fears of racial degeneration and decline were also shaped. Eugenic fears of racial degeneration and decline, right, also shaped the construction of welfare at the turn of the century. The concept of race suicide was very much a kind of recurring theme among progressive reformers who worried, again, right, that the defective, the dependent, and the delinquent classes were outbreeding those who were respectable. Robert Dugdale's study from 1874 called The Dukes, a study of crime, pauperism, disease, and hereditary was a key work in this respect, focusing on what it described as a degenerate white family. The study argued that the Dukes had bred widely and indiscriminately, thereby creating generations of so-called inferior individuals who were a financial burden on the state. The study was widely taken up by progressive reformers who argued that society could no longer function on a laissez-faire basis. Laissez-faire was economically outmoded and ethically inadequate, as it encouraged inefficiency, idleness, and waste. And so in other words, a stronger administrative state was needed to support the lives of those who were deemed fit and productive members of society, while segregating, controlling, and excluding those seen to be undeserving and dysgenic. And that here include the disabled, racial minorities, immigrants, and other populations who were deemed to be unfit. And again, right, so from the very beginning, the welfare state thus operated through and alongside the carceral state. Perhaps somewhat more surprisingly, in Sweden, eugenics was also foundational, right, to the creation of state-sponsored care and welfare. The world's first Institute for Race Biology was created at Uppsala University in 1922, following a bill in Parliament, which was signed by representatives of all political parties. There was a broad consensus that the Institute was needed to study public health, human hereditary, and racial hygiene in order to preserve the integrity of the Swedish people and prevent racial degeneration. In many ways, this new institute continued a long line of Swedish eugenic and race biological research that can be traced all the way back to Carl von Linnaeus and his classification of humanity into 4 distinct races. But under the directorship of Herman Lundborg, the institute mapped so-called racial traits, and it promoted racial hygiene by specifically studying the indigenous Sami, Roma and traveler communities, Jews and Finns, as well as people who were labeled as criminals and vagrants. The Institute's working methods included skull measurement and photos that were taken of people both with and without their clothes. The Institute also dug up and collected Sami skeletons, and I should say here, right, that Uppsala University still has some of these human remains in its collection, even though Sami communities have long demanded their return and their reburial. So this institute was created at the very dawn of the golden age of Swedish social democracy. In 1920, the first social democratic government was formed, and in 1928, Prime Minister Per Albin Hansson launched the concept of the people's home, which became synonymous with the welfare state. 2 years later, the Stockholm exhibition launched functionalist architecture and design. Funkis, as it came to be known, prioritized clean lines, geometric shapes, flat roofs, large windows, and emphasized health, light, and air. But while this exhibition very quickly came to be seen as the aesthetic manifesto of the emerging welfare state, it was also shaped by a concern for eugenics, hygiene, and nation building, centered around the white Swede as the modern, industrious, and morally upright citizen. In fact, as part of the exhibition, Lundborg, who was the director, right, of the Institute of Race Biology, also presented some of his latest findings on racial hygiene. Chief among the social democratic reformers were Alva and Gunnar Myrdal. So both of these were very well-known intellectuals. Alva would later serve as the Swedish ambassador to India, and she would come to play a prominent role in the international disarmament movement, for which she won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1982. Gunnar, meanwhile, was a professor of economics at Stockholm University and also a member of parliament. He would later serve as Minister of Commerce and Industry in the 1940s, and he too would win the Nobel Prize, but in economics in 1974. Together, right, the Myrdals adhere to a vision of society that actually owes much the Fabian's emphasis on gradualist socialism, state-led welfare reforms, and technocratic social planning. For state intervention and social engineering, they effectively sought to create a rational and a planned society that combined technocratic expertise with the needs of everyday life. In 1934, they published this book here, Crisis in the Population Question, which is widely seen as being the kind of foundational text of the Swedish welfare state. The book focuses on what it describes as the problem of population decline in Western states. In the case of Sweden, this is predominantly driven by falling birth rates in combination with emigration, which between the years 1870 and 1914 saw about 1 million people, or 1/6 of the overall population, leave Sweden for the US. The Myrdals argued that the population decline was tied to economic instability, to inadequate housing, and to the lack of gender equality. This also then meant that this was a trend that could be reversed through the introduction of welfare policies in the sphere of reproduction, housing, and family life, including through things like public housing, child allowances, maternal care, progressive family planning, and general health care. But here's the thing, right? The goal was not just more people, but it was really about the right kind of people. And so alongside these positive eugenic policies, right, that were really meant to encourage the reproduction of the fit and the healthy, the Myrdals also argued for a number of negative eugenic policies that were meant to circumscribe the reproductive freedom of those who they saw as being feeble-minded, problem families, and maladjusted groups. And so this included things like harsher immigration policies, as immigration, in their view, would result in lower social standards of the working class. They also advocated for the sterilization of those who were deemed to be unfit, disabled, or racially degenerate, people who they described as being the social substratum. As Alva Myrdal writes in Nation and Family, which I think also quite tellingly contains a foreword by Patrick Moynihan, she writes, in our day of highly accelerated social reforms, the need for sterilization on social grounds gain momentum. Generous social reforms may facilitate homemaking and more childbearing than before among the groups of less desirable as well as more desirable parents. Gunnar Myrdal, it is worth pointing out, was a friend and also a supporter of Gunnar Dahlberg, who took over as the director of the Institute of Race Biology in 1935. I think it is important to emphasize here, right, that the Myrdals did not always frame their arguments in explicit racialized language, right? And Gunnar Myrdal would later on famously reject the existence of biological race in his 1944 book, An American Dilemma. But nonetheless, right, the discussion that they offer here, which is very much about national decline and the population crisis, right, it's undergirded by a racialized understanding of deservingness, of belonging, and of productivity. And so a year after the book was published in 1945, the Social Democratic government made sterilization without consent legal in cases where the patient suffered from mental illness, feeble-mindedness, or other mental defects. This was subsequently expanded in 1941 to allow sterilization to counteract what the law describes as antisocial behavior. And so up until 1975, when this law was finally abolished, nearly 63,000 people were sterilized, and almost 90% of them were women. Most of those were targeted, were deemed to be feeble-minded, right? They were said to be socially deviant and unable to parent properly. They predominantly came from Sami, Roma, Finnish, and Jewish backgrounds. And so overall in Sweden, eugenics was not a deviation from welfare and social democracy, but rather the emergence of the welfare state itself unfolded according to eugenic logics of population quality and racial hygiene. This really also needs to be understood alongside the colonial extraction, the mass displacement, and the expansion of mining, the forest industry and water power on stolen Sami land in the north, right, which all accelerated during this so-called golden age of welfare and social democracy, and which, of course, ultimately helped fund and build it. And so what we see, right, across these cases that I've just described to you is really welfare operating as a mechanism of stratified social reproduction within global racial capitalism. Here, the question of welfare turns out to, from the very beginning, have been closely linked to concerns over empire, immigration, and revolution. Within this system, logics of care and carcerality have always existed side by side. Or, as Stedman Jones puts it, historians of the welfare state have concentrated upon proposals for old age pensions, free education, free school meals, subsidized housing, and national insurance. They virtually ignored parallel proposals to segregate the casual poor, to establish detention centers for loafers, to separate pauper children from degenerate parents, or to ship the residuum overseas. Yet for contemporaries, both sorts of proposals compose parts of a single debate. Now, in building these new welfare institutions, social reformers drew on governing practices and repertoires of population management that had been developed and refined across the colonies. Imperial strategies of detention, of labor discipline, and preventive confinement ultimately came to inform early domestic welfare practices and institutions, such as labor colonies, reformatories, and institutions for the so-called mentally deficient. And so what I want to do, right, as part of this bigger project that I'm working on, is to really trace how these colonial logics came to inform the development of three main sites of welfare, namely public housing, public schooling, and public healthcare. Across these sites, right, we see the entanglement of care and carcerality in, for example, the governance of leper colonies, of quarantine stations, isolation hospitals, psychiatric wards, and other distinctively carceral health measures. We see it also in the origins of council housing and its relationship to slum clearance, as well as in the role of ragged industrial and settler colonial residential schools and their role in policing delinquency and underservingness. Ultimately, right, it's my contention that many of these racialized and eugenic logics continue to structure welfare today. What was once referred to as the residuum and the criminal class would later morph into so-called problem families, welfare queens, chavs, the not integrated and the dependent, as well as attendant theories around culture of poverty, right, and the cycle of deprivation. These are the kinds of arguments that today show up in discussions about sink estates, high-rise tower blocks, and youth gangs in the UK, as well as in discussions about immigrant suburbs and so-called parallel societies in Sweden. From this perspective, what is today often told, right, as a story about austerity and about the rollback of welfare is, I think, better understood, not as a dismantling or even as a decline of welfare, right? But it's rather a retrenchment and an intensification of logics that have long structured state-sponsored care and welfare. As in earlier formations, welfare provision is today increasingly unevenly distributed, conditional, and is oriented towards the management, right, of those that are deemed to be surplus. Today's welfare crisis, then, is less of a breakdown and more of a reconfiguration along these older and uneven lines, in which welfare operates as a racialized technology of pacification, abandonment, and control. And so this brings us then, right, to the question of what it might mean to care differently, right, beyond capital and state logics. Which is to say, how might we work towards a more wayward, an unruly, and perhaps a more anarchistic form of abolition, which seeks not just to fund care, but ultimately to transform and to conceive of it anew, namely what I'm calling fugitive care. Fugitivity, Fred Moten writes in Stolen Life, is a desire for and a spirit of escape and transgression of the proper and the proposed. It's a desire for the outside, for playing or being outside, an outlaw edge proper to the now always already improper voice or instrument. And so as part of this attempt, right, to think care fugitively, one of the things that I would like to do, right, is to construct a so-called anarchive to riff off Jack Halberstam, right, of various movements, local communities, and organizers that have sought to reclaim and reimagine what it means to actually care. There are many examples of this, right? But just to mention a few, we can think of the Black Panther Party's survival programs, which included things like free breakfast for children, health clinics, and educational initiatives. We can also think of the Young Lords and the Lincoln Hospital takeover in New York in 1968. Another example would be the Socialist Patients Collective in Berlin, ACT UP and other forms of AIDS activism, indigenous, queer, trans, and women's health collectives, and various rent strikes, anti-eviction, and squatter movements. Together, right, I think that many of these movements show us what care, well-being, and social reproduction could be, or at least what it might become once reimagined as a collective and as a liberatory praxis, rather than as a state-imposed and stratified service that operates according to the needs of capital. And I think you're going to stop here. Thank you so much for listening.